Merci. It's been a very good morning, a very good and productive morning, and we still have work to do this afternoon. Mais je suis très heureux et très honoré que la secrétaire exécutive de la Convention-cadre des Nations unies sur les changements climatiques, Mme Christiana Figueres, ait accepté de participer à ce sommet à titre de conférencière principale. Now, Christiana, I promised I would never call you Christina again. I've been doing this time and time again. It's over. Christiana. Vous pouvez vous l'imaginer. You can imagine that her time is full. So the fact that she could come here and meet with us at only 7 months between now and the Paris conference speaks a lot about her engagement and availability. Et ça montre également l'importance qu'elle accorde au rôle que nous ici, nous pouvons jouer lors de la conférence de Paris. Notre présence également aujourd'hui à nous tous traduit notre volonté de répondre à son appel et celui de la communauté internationale. Mme Figueres a été nommée secrétaire exécutive de la Conférence sur les changements climatiques en 2010 par le secrétaire général, M. Ban Ki-moon. Son mandat a été reconduit en juillet 2013 pour 3 autres années. So it's a little bit like politics. You do this in 3 or 4 years portions. Toutefois, Mme Figueres n'était pas une nouvelle venue à la Convention-cadre puisqu'elle participe aux négociations internationales sur le climat depuis 1995. D'abord membre de la délégation du Costa Rica, elle est ensuite devenue membre du conseil exécutif du Mécanisme pour un développement propre, puis vice-présidente du bureau de la Conférence des partis. Ses écrits sur l'élaboration de solutions au changement climatique sont publiés à grande échelle. Dans ce domaine, elle a fréquemment apporté ses conseils au secteur privé et elle est une conférencière prisée dans le milieu universitaire. En 1995, elle a fondé le Centre pour le développement durable des Amériques et a pris les rênes du secrétariat technique de l'Initiative de l'énergie renouvelable dans les Amériques. Elle a été également membre de plusieurs conseils d'administration d'organisations non gouvernementales, toutes engagées dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques. Son engagement envers la reconnaissance des efforts des États fédérés et des régions en matière de lutte contre les changements climatiques dans le prochain régime climatique international est notable et nous lui en sommes toutes reconnaissants. À quelques mois de la conférence de Paris, nous espérons que les États fédérés et leurs alliés auront une place de choix, et nous aurons une place de choix. We will have our place, our moment to speak in Paris next December. Parce que dans ce prochain accord international sur le climat, de plus en plus, on se rend compte que nous faisons partie de la solution. On veut donc vous assurer, Madame, de notre pleine et entière collaboration à cet égard. J'aimerais également d'emblée vous transmettre nos plus chaleureuses félicitations et nos remerciements, encore une fois, les plus sincères pour avoir accepté notre invitation, ainsi que pour votre engagement infatigable et indéfectible envers la cause du climat. Mme Figueres, à vous la parole.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. I first would like to apologize that I will not speak in French. I have to tell you, the first time I met with Minister Fabius of France, who will be our COP president, he immediately launched, very eloquently into his vision of COP21 in French, and I was listening very attentively, and then answered in English. Let me get my languages straight. Answered in English, and he said, "Ms. Figueres, you understand French, but you don't speak French?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I'm afraid that that's right." He said, "Well, we will change that before Paris." So guess what I have to do between 2 and 3 in the morning? But I'm not quite there yet, but thank you very much for this very kind invitation. And Premier Couillard, thank you very much for this invitation. And at the risk of being very public and disclosing your secret weapons of success, let me share with you that the Premier invited me first at a quick meeting that we had to come, and I went, April, and I knew there were 1,000 things on the calendar in April, and I was, non-committal. Yes, I would love to, but I'm not quite sure. Soon after, I received a letter from the Premier. Thank you very much for accepting to come. That's the way to do it. So that is a test of your commitment, and I really thank you, Premier. Thank you very much for that. And I would also like to, of course, congratulate Ontario for your fantastic announcement, and British Columbia for that wonderful meet or beat, and the promise to revise the Climate Action Plan to 2.0. Premier, you have invited us. This is my very first time in Quebec City, and you have invited us to this fantastic, fantastic walled city. But I gather that the point of your invitation to all of us is to see precisely beyond the walls of Quebec City, certainly beyond the walls of Quebec, and in fact beyond the walls of all the provinces of Canada, and even beyond the wall of Canada. And I gather that the invitation to me was to actually provide you with some perspective of the bigger picture of what is going out there. Going on out there. So let me share with you just two of the elements, because you have mentioned this morning quite a few times Paris and COP21. Let me just mention two elements. There will be many, many deliverables at COP21, but I just wanted to highlight two because I think they are of most interest to you. The first element is the collection of what we call, and I apologize, this is going to be my only acronym today, the INDCs, which are the intended nationally developed contributions, nationally determined contributions, which each country is presenting as their first contribution to the global effort. We have already received a total of 34 INDCs representing from 32 industrialized countries and 2 developing countries as distinct as Mexico and Gabon. 2 very, very distinct and different developing countries. But we have also received, as I say, from 32 countries, and I'm very grateful that at the meeting of leaders in Panama just a few days ago, Prime Minister Harper said that Canada would send its INDC before the meeting of the G7, because, as you know, Canada belongs to that very elite club of G7 countries, and they are meeting in June. And Prime Minister Harper has said that he will be sending the INDC in before that meeting. So I'm grateful to hear that news, and I look forward to seeing in that INDC that Canada truly is taking this challenge seriously, together with all other countries of the world. The second element that I would like, and let me just quickly add, we actually expect that that we will have certainly all industrialized countries with their INDCs in, and we expect the vast majority of developing countries, all high emitters, all emerging countries, and perhaps the tiny, tiny, tiny little countries will not be able to present their INDC, although here we have Gabon already with its INDC. But we do certainly expect to be able to cover at least 80 to 85% of greenhouse gas emissions around the world with INDCs this year in a timely fashion. And we will then be emitting a synthesis report for all countries to look at that before Paris. The second element that I wanted to highlight for you is the agreement itself, because I do want to point out that the collection of INDCs are not necessarily the same as the agreement. The collection of INDCs, and the collection I mean because it's a collection of countries, are meant to cover the first efforts that countries are making in a post-2020 world, which will cover either 2020 to 2025 or 2030, depending on the choice. But the agreement is meant to be something much longer lasting, of longer shelf life. It is meant to have universal participation, so different from the Kyoto Protocol. It is meant to cover all economies and 100% of greenhouse gases. And it is also picking up on some of the very interesting topics that you discussed this morning. It is meant to be populated, if you will, with efforts that come bottom up. So each country will analyze from the perspective of their geography, from the perspective of their resource base, from the perspective of the technologies that they have available to them, and so on and so forth. They will be putting forward those INDCs that will be anchored into the agreement, but where the agreement will be pretty clear in saying the agreement is meant as a longer-term framework where we will have a first set of indices, a second, a third, and I don't know how many more, but certainly a much, much longer time period and a framework that allows for differentiation. And today, a lot of the conversation was about the differentiation among provinces in Canada. You can imagine that that conversation is very similar conversation at the global level, because there is differentiation even among industrialized countries, and certainly between industrialized countries and developing. So how that differentiation is exactly going to take place still remains to be seen, but I tend to think of the agreement with respect to differentiation as a house with many rooms where everyone needs to feel certainly challenged, but still comfortable in that room. Having said that, having recognized that that agreement is going to be populated with a bottom-up approach, it's also very important to understand that that agreement is going to be guided by science. And I was very appreciative that we started this morning's discussion with an overview of the science, because this really is a policy response to the science certainty that we now have in front of us. And to answer one of the questions that came up this morning from Manitoba, how much is enough? Well, the IPCC has actually been pretty clear. The IPCC has said if governments want to keep the increase in temperature to below 2 degrees, which everyone has already agreed to because it is within the bounds of economic risk that we can support, then what that means is that we will have to reach global peaking of emissions within the next 10 years, decline, and get to what is being called carbon neutrality or climate neutrality over the next 50 years. That means into the second half of the century. When you think about it, what that actually brings us to is to an extraordinary challenge that is, on the one hand, reestablishing the ecological balance between the emissions that we will continue to emit and the natural capacity of the Earth to absorb those emissions. We have to reestablish that balance, but we have to do that in the context of 2 billion people more on this Earth and of the demands of economic growth that is going to take, in particular, to bring the population that is still under the poverty line above the poverty line and into the kind of well-being that everyone deserves and is striving for. So quite a challenge for all countries. And what is very clear is that in order to reach that, we have to accept that Paris is not a one-time effort, that the COP in and of itself is not going to solve climate change, that even the INDCs, although they will cover 5 to 10 years, are not going to be the answer. The sum total, I can already tell you, without even knowing what Canada's number is, without even knowing what everybody else is, I can already tell you the sum total of those INDCs are not going to be enough to keep us under 2 degrees. That is why it is very important to recognize all of these first efforts, as first contributions, but also at the same time to recognize that what Paris needs to do is to put us on a safe pathway. That is fundamentally the function of the Paris Agreement, to put all countries onto a safe pathway. If you will, you can think about it as constructing a very broad highway with many different lanes, because some will be faster than others, some will be slower than others, there will be different speeds, there will be different vehicles of engagement, because we do have an extraordinary diversity around the world. So there will have to be many different lanes, but we all need to agree that this highway is actually leading us together to the same destination, which is climate neutrality by the second half of the century, and that along the way, we're going to help each other get there. There is no such thing as one city, one province, one country doing it alone. And you have discussed that this morning. Everybody needs to help each other to get there. I was very honored to witness your conversation this morning. And let me say, it is not very often that I have the chance to peek under the domestic kimono and listen to a domestic conversation, okay? My job has me listening to the international conversation. But to peek under the domestic kimono was very, very enriching and very humbling for me. And I was really impressed with how is it possible that Canada, as large as it is, but it is only one country, how is it possible that you have, inside of the Canadian borders, you have a microcosm, a full microcosm of the full discussion around the world? You have the different resource bases, right? You have some provinces that are still coal-based. You have some provinces that are oil and gas. You have some provinces in the north that are highly vulnerable. And that said this morning very clearly, don't talk to us about mitigation. We're about adaptation. Do you understand how vulnerable we are? Same conversation that we're having at the international level. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So here are 3 points that I thought were actually very, very interesting, drawing from the fact that Canada can really be seen as a microcosm. First, well, of course, the multicultural, multilingual. How many languages do you have in Canada? About as many as the UN, right? Almost, almost. But first, it's very clear that participation in responding to climate change in Canada is actually going to be populated by the bottom-up approach. So we already see the leadership of provinces taking very different routes, very different measures, using very different tools, but you see the provinces doing it. What the provinces are doing within Canada, now translate, that is what countries are doing at the global level. Each of them assessing their reality and figuring out how can they contribute. We have provinces in Canada, some that have ETS, some that have tax systems, some that still don't have anything. Same thing at the global level. Exactly the same thing. We have ETS systems, 7 in China, moving to a national emission trading scheme by next year. We have, of course, the ETS system of the EU, the REGI, WCI, and Korea. And we also have tax systems operating in Mexico, very soon in Chile, in South Africa. So you have that same, and some countries going the route of regulation and legislation. So you have the same diversity at the global level that you have here with respect to the bottom-up approach, proving that there is a need for diversity in approaches. You cannot, and I think it was Premier you who said this morning, there's no such thing as one size fits all. You have to have that diversity of approaches, and not only do you have to tolerate the diversity of approaches, you have to foment that diversity and encourage that diversity, because each of them functions as an incubator with respect to the reality of the jurisdiction that can then be used later on by other jurisdictions that have similar conditions. So very, very important experience of incubating solutions and beginning to grapple with the reality that each of you have. And of course, to come to your point, Premier, very interesting how carbon pricing for those provinces that are using one or the other is actually aligning cost with opportunity. Because I heard your point, Madam, that we tend, as human beings, we tend to always think about the cost and not the opportunity. Well, carbon pricing actually allows us to align those two for those that choose that too. Second, very interesting way in which Canada is a microcosm. There is a realization that bottom-up approach, as rich as it is not cost-effective in the end run. It doesn't give us the final results that we need, and there is a realization that national policy from Canadian point of view, that a national policy that would bring all of these different strands together would help Canada be more efficient about its carbon management. The same thing at the international level. Yes, we have all of these bottom-up approaches, but the reason why we are walking toward a Paris Agreement is because the agreement itself overlaid over all of those country approaches is what is going to give us more efficiency and certainly more effectiveness. And the third issue that struck me in this conversation this morning is the huge challenge that we have around the transition out of the reliance on fossil fuels. Now, is that going to happen overnight? No. Is it going to be easy? No. However, it is something that we need to engage with. And from a Canadian perspective, I would say very, very difficult to continue to have the Canadian economy be exposed to volatility in prices in oil that are causing right now a deficit, but that we know stem from a price war that Canada cannot win, neither today nor in the future. And so how do we protect the Canadian economy? How do we protect growth? How do we protect job security in a very, very different environment that is appearing in front of our eyes? And certainly knowing that that is not going to happen overnight. It is not about an abrupt change, because that would help no one. It is about an orderly transition that has stability and job creation at its heart. So here are the three, that context provides me with the opportunity to share with you, and you know, the famous saying, it's very difficult to predict, to make any projection, particularly when it's about the future. However, let me share with you three changing realities that are already operating. The first, it used to be that growth in GDP brought a growth in GHG. That's the way that humanity functioned for 150 years. That is no longer the case. That is no longer the case. 2014 was the first year in which the International Energy Agency put out the figures that showed that GHG emissions stayed flat and GDP, global GDP, went up. Over the past, global GDP, okay? Over the past 5 years, OECD has gone up 7% in GDP and gone down 4% in greenhouse gases. China went up 4% in GDP and down 1% in greenhouse gases. So is this beginning to be a trend? Possibly. Possibly we're beginning to de-link the growth in GDP, the economic growth, from the growth in greenhouse gases, and that is exactly what we need to pursue. So we may be at the cusp of that kind of a transformation. Second reality that is in front of our eyes. It used to be that renewable energies were not competitive with fossil fuels. That is also no longer the case. In 60 jurisdictions, we already have renewable energy being cost competitive, grid parity with fossil fuels, because of declining costs of generation, because of improvements in storage. And in fact, we're beginning to see that all projections on renewable energy are being constantly outstripped, including projections of job creation, which are every day more in the clean energy space. And there is no doubt that over the next 20 years, we're going to be seeing dramatic growth in renewable energy, much more than we've seen up until now, and certainly in distributed energy systems, probably akin to those of you who are old enough to remember the transition from landlines to cell phones, probably akin to that kind of a radical transformation is what we're going to be seeing in the energy system. Third changing reality in front of our eyes. It used to be that the demand growth for fossil fuels was constant and predictable. No longer the case. No longer the case. The OECD demand has flattened and in fact declined. The US is increasingly self-sufficient. in and of itself, a very important reality for Canada. And so then the eyes, of course, turn to the emerging countries where most of the growth demand is expected. But I will share with you that in the emerging countries, we cannot count on predictable demand growth for two reasons: policy and physics. Policy, because they are increasingly putting in measures that they themselves are less reliant on fossil fuels. China has already announced, and they will make it official within a couple of months, that they will be peaking coal in 2020, and they will be peaking across all the greenhouse gases by 2030, if not before, and so on and so forth. So not something that we can count on as an export potential to know that there's going to be increasing demand for fossil fuels. And secondly, physics. We heard today, this morning, about the physical impacts of climate change on Canada. Multiply that times 10, times 100. Those are the physical impacts on developing countries. And those physical impacts on developing countries are actually going to stunt growth. If you don't have growth in developing countries, you cannot have the demand for fossil fuel imports. So for both reasons, we can no longer count on constant and predictable demand growth from emerging countries. Now, that does not mean, don't get me wrong, that does not mean that we are going to eliminate fossil fuels before tomorrow morning at 6 in the morning. That's not going to happen. We're not going to eliminate fossil fuels overnight. But it does point to new realities and to new market conditions that Canada should consider. And it certainly calls for a balanced approach and progressive but decided steps for Canada to join the new economy and to ensure that it actually protects its own economy and prospers from that economy. So what does it mean from Canada, seen from the outside? Well, probably building on your already very, very clean energy matrix, both with more investment in renewables as well as energy efficiency, as was pointed out, because of job creation opportunities. It does point for an orderly transition toward cleaner fuels, and I'm very grateful for the reminder that Canada has an incredible competitive value here with CCS experience. CCS is a technology that has to be on the table, and it is still way too expensive to be deployed at the level that it needs to be deployed. A huge opportunity for Canada to continue to optimize its oil and gas and provide good and marketable CCS technology, in particular to those countries that will still have coal, such as China, who know that unabated coal will no longer be possible, but they have to abate it. So a huge opportunity for Canada. And it is, of course, as I say, no different. Those measures that Canada can take are no different from other economies that are struggling with very, very similar issues, and from the world as a whole. So what does that mean? Well, for me, it means I was in Ottawa yesterday talking to the federal government, and frankly, my conclusion from these 2 wonderful days here in Canada, and one more tomorrow, which I look forward to, is that there is a huge value, as you have already discussed this morning, of provinces working with each other, even more than you have been up until now. There's a huge value in developing common currency, as I would call it, common methodologies, growing the consensus in order to enable a much, much better fertilized ground for the federal government to be able to make the decisions. And secondly, there is also a lot of value in strengthening the collaboration between federal government and provinces to help each other, and in order to benefit every single Canadian citizen. That is not an either or. That is an and also. It is not about choosing between collaboration among the provinces or collaboration with the government, with the federal government. It is an and also, because that is the only way that this is going to make sense. And finally, let me draw quite liberally from Sir Wilfrid Laurier, who you know better than I talked about his governing motive to harmonize the diverse elements of this country. And I would liberally take that very, very profound thought and say, you know, everyone who is concerned and wants to contribute to the stability, to the safety, to the prosperity of the Canadian economy, the governing motive of each one of you, and if I may, just because I'm here for a few days, say each one of us, should be to harmonize the diverse elements of this fantastic country. And by extension, because you are a microcosm, by extension, help to harmonize the diverse elements of the world through a better conversation among 194 countries. I thank you all for your astonishing commitment to think through these very, very difficult challenges that we have all inherited, but that we cannot inherit further. It is left to our generation to solve this, and I see this room full of people who are committed to doing so. Thank you.